Haven't done one of these in a while. I always struggle ending reviews. As long or short as any given video is, it is never the totality of what I could or even want to say. But at some point, I decide that it's over, that I don't want to do this anymore and I gotta wrap it up. But how? I know that I often don't give people a review in the traditional sense, and so there was a time where I'd put a summation at the end with what I believed folks who clicked on a review may have actually wanted. But let's be real, no one who wanted a traditional review is going to make it that far. So now I look for some kind of definitive declarative statement, and I will cut entire paragraphs off of the ends of these in order to find something that I can say with vigor, and then pause for 2 seconds, which is exactly as much transition as I need to get into the scoring, closing animation, thanking of patrons, etc. But not in the last video. My sprawling discussion of Charlie Kaufman's third directorial feature, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. In that one, I should have ended with the grand proclamation about how Kaufman has decided to use cinema to express his very specific, alarmingly bleak worldview, and how glad I am for that. But then I noted that he'd actually written a book, and wasn't that interesting, and I would probably read it at some point. And then I gave the score. This was the content equivalent of my aside in the shower, a deflation of drama that highlights the meaninglessness of what preceded it, what followed it, and what it was, what everything is. The film is a work of absurdism, and I wanted the video to reflect that. What I didn't mention was that I had already bought Kaufman's book, and by the time the video was live, I had started reading it. And pretty much immediately, I realized that it would have to be the subject of my next review. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week Air Review. You can call me a third-rate critic. And today, I am talking about ANTKIND. Not that I haven't prefaced this enough, but it's important to me that you know that this isn't the review I thought I was going to make. As I was reading, I took notes, bookmarked dozens of pages, and highlighted many more than that. I intended to go back and construct an argument that was probably about Charlie Kaufman and wokeness. I said as much on a live stream last week. But then I got to the final chapters of this fucking 705-page tome, and I realized that was missing the point. As was taking notes and highlighting and referencing, so I scrapped it and started from scratch, deciding to write the whole thing from memory, because that is literally, although not figuratively, what the book is about. ANTKIND is told from the perspective of one B. Rosenberg, a straight white cis male film critic who uses an initial and the gender-neutral "thon" pronoun to hide all of the above because he doesn't want his straight white cis maleness to impact how the audience views his writings on, for example, Black director William Greaves, or gender in the 1914 film A Florida Enchantment, which is centered on a seed that, when eaten, changes a person's sex. I assumed that this film was fake, like so many of the others that are mentioned in this book, but no, it is real and incredibly racist. He is obsessed with his straight white cis maleness and feels the constant need to tell everyone around him just how aware he is of his own privilege, and also that he has an African American girlfriend, and perhaps most importantly, is not Jewish despite what you may think from his name and also how he looks. These are facts that he relays to pretty much every single person he comes across. And it's weird. Like, if Charlie Kaufman weren't Jewish, I would probably think he's a low-key anti-Semite, given the intensity with which his protagonist protests each time someone so much as considers the idea that he might be Jewish. B seems genuinely offended at the prospect. And I know that there's a lot of self-loathing going on with cultural Jews in particular, and that's obviously what's happening here. But I am also very unqualified to talk about this particular aspect of the story, so I'm going to stop there. B isn't just deeply unpleasant as a person, he is also the worst kind of film critic, the one that gives all of the rest of us a bad name. He feels that a movie can only be seen properly if it's seen 7 separate times, and he has a clear routine which includes watching movies both upside down and backwards. He hates everything even vaguely commercial, ripping into the works of Christopher Nolan, as well as classics like Blade Runner and The French Connection. And while not so mainstream, he has a particular hatred for the hack Charlie Kaufman described at one point as Godzilla with dentures. At least 5 of those 700 plus pages are dedicated to anti-Kaufman screed, sprinkled liberally whenever B feels like digging into what he considers the more pretentious side of cinema. And even if it's true that Kaufman films err on the side of pretension, what B feels about that is completely irrelevant, since his myriad rankings of cinema's finest that we get subjected to throughout are full of European and Japanese filmmakers that you've never heard of. The only English language director to ever appear is Judd Apatow, whose work B finds a truly remarkable reflection of the human condition. It's not entirely clear who this recurring joke is at the expense of, but it's probably Judd Apatow in a similar way to that bizarre but hilarious Robert Zemeckis diss in I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Now, while there's the obvious gut reaction of how fucking dare you, sir, it is of course worth remembering that this Charlie Kaufman is also the author of the book, and that's weird too. While in St. Augustine, Florida, working on one of his stories, B finds himself in conversation with Ingo Cutbirth, an aging black man at first in whiteface, shouting epithets that B makes sure to clarify cannot actually be made towards him because he is not Jewish. But in any case, Cutbirth has made a movie that no one has seen. He's been working on it for 90 years, and it is 3 months long, including daily breaks. And more importantly, he only wants it to ever be shown once. After B sees it, it will be destroyed. B realizes almost immediately that the film, a truly sprawling stop-motion dramedy, is a masterpiece. Quite possibly the best movie that has ever been made, and certainly the thing that will make him the household name he's always believed that he deserves to be when he shares it with the world. And when Cutbirth dies 17 days into the screening, B gets his chance to do that. He finishes the film and then packs it, as well as all of the puppets that he can find on the property, into a truck and heads back to New York. But Cutbirth's word shall not be disrespected, and the truck catches fire while B is in the middle of trying to explain to a fast food cashier that his girlfriend is African American. He jumps into the flames to save it, but obviously that's a terrible idea, and then he wakes up in a hospital post-reconstruction. The fact that his nose is now larger because they believed he was Jewish, and that its extra size came in part from foreskin that they removed under the assumption that he had missed his bris the first time around, feels worth mentioning, but I said I wasn't going to talk about it anymore, so will remain uncommented upon. And from that point, he makes it his mission to remember this movie. And it's all-consuming, or at least mostly consuming, because there's a lot going on in the world outside of B's memories. For the remainder of the book, we ping-pong between the film as he remembers it, largely brought back thanks to hypnotherapy, and also his life outside of those hypnotherapy sessions, while he is attempting to survive in an increasingly demented world. And the world does legitimately fall apart around him. Charlie Kaufman's stories often devolve into chaos. The edges of reality break apart as John Malkovich goes into his own mind, or the denizens of Synecdoche, New York, riot in the perfectly replicated city streets. But there's a limitation to what can be depicted by virtue of the film's limited budgets. The earth will not be set ablaze in a Charlie Kaufman film. But in a book, freed from the shackles of financial obligations where he can go anywhere and everywhere, he takes full advantage. Setting the world on fire is just the beginning. And that really is what makes this book so fascinating, because Kaufman's first scripts were his ideas filtered through the point of view of Spike Jonze and Michel Gondry and George Clooney. The next gave him far more control, but he's still working with actors and production designers and cinematographers, and they all add their own perspective. This is the whole argument against auteur theory. Yes, you can tell a Charlie Kaufman or Wes Anderson movie when you see one, but even the most exacting director still needs their work to be realized by other people. You aren't getting their raw creativity. ANTKIND is Kaufman raw, or perhaps Kaufman distilled. Every page drips with comically depressed oddity. Film Crit Hulk, who is much smarter than me and someone I support on Patreon in the same way you could support me if you'd like, just saying, wrote about his fundamental difficulty with I'm thinking of ending things, and it came down to Kaufman's hopelessness. Now, as someone who could accurately be described as fatalistic, I related deeply to young woman's statements about how humanity created hope as a form of escape from the always terrible reality of the present. I hear that and think, yes. In fact, I wrote down the quote in my notes while watching the film as something that I agreed with wholeheartedly. Whereas Film Crit Hulk hears it and thinks, but hope still exists, and that matters. But does it though? What has hope done for us lately? He also said that my emotional experience of playing The Last of Us Part 2 is impossible because how could someone be subjected to Abby's point of view for 10 hours and still want Ellie to exact her revenge? And I don't see how one couldn't. Bad storytelling, Naughty Dog. It's a large part of why Kaufman's work resonates with me. It's why, despite fully understanding what I'm thinking of ending things is metaphorically depicting, I continue to reject the idea that it's a film to be explained or understood or that it all means something. And I get that people want to come out the other end feeling like there was a point to it all. But also, why? Someone got very mad that I said folks who need meaning in that movie are boring, which was some pretty hardcore telling on himself, but I stand by it. And it was interesting to see Kaufman effectively comment on some of what I said in that review in this book. On the one hand, B literally puts Eugene Ionesco and Luis Buñuel into a list of similar artists where I actively distinguished between their styles. And on the other, B calls out Kaufman's obsession with absurdist theater while chastising his surface-level understanding of the movement, so I felt some vindication there. Much of what happens in ANTKIND feels like a joke played on the reader. Why else would you have a sequence from the perspective of Donald J. Trunk as he has an animatronic version of himself built that he then becomes romantically involved with? What profundity comes from having B fuck a mountain? I'm glad said mountain consented, but also, really? The book, throughout, but especially in the back half, goes to some deeply weird places, and just for a lark. The original draft was 900 pages, and his editor asked for that to be nearly halved, but Kaufman refused to cut so deeply, because going fewer than 700 would have forced him to start removing the things that he enjoyed about the book. And I get that. Look, ANTKIND is really funny. I grinned throughout the read and would audibly guffaw at least once every few pages. All of my distaste for B as a person made the series of unfortunate events that befell him a whole lot funnier. But it's not just the situations that are funny. The language itself is. It's a pretty dense book. It uses a lot of big words that I didn't know, like bootyracious, which is an adjective form of butter. So I was grateful to have been reading it on a Kindle, where I could just long press words to look them up. If you're a well-read person with an MFA in literature, I'm sure you'll be fine. But it was hard for me at times, especially since a lot of these words function as jokes themselves and are intentionally misused or misspelled. Apparently his copy editor had quite the time adding notes like, I think this was intentional, but it's also wrong, so if it wasn't intentional, you should fix it. Meaning they don't always show up in the Kindle dictionary, so I would have to context clue it up or just accept that I didn't understand that one sentence, and it really didn't matter. But even if much of what happens in ANTKIND is meaningless, it does have something to say about the unseen in our society. Ingo Cutbirth's movie is largely about comedy, with specific attention paid to Mudd and Malloy, an Abbott and Costello type pair who also try to make it in Hollywood and on stage, but run into problems, and it's actually genuinely interesting. I would at the very least consider watching that story if it were to come to Netflix or whatever. But more important than what's on screen is what's off. Because as I mentioned, this film is stop motion, so every single frame is meticulously planned, and that plan is so much bigger than anyone could imagine. Sometimes when I'm watching a movie, I laugh about the idea that immediately off screen there are a bunch of people just staring at what's going on. Maybe someone is controlling a light or holding a container full of fake snow. We have no idea what exists beyond the edges of the camera sensor. And that's more often than not because there's nothing to see. But that isn't true in Cutbirth's film. He may only be capturing a portion of the world, but he is telling its entire story. He is not just animating the people on screen. He's animating everyone, literally thousands of extras who never once appear in the film because society isn't interested in their stories. But Cutbirth is. He cares about those people and wants to make sure that they get their due. It does make you wonder about those unseen people. What are they doing? What are their stories? We never know, and we rarely think about it. We're not told that we're being deprived, and so we don't wonder about the fact that we are. With Cutbirth's opus, he has chosen not to tell us those stories, even as he tells them on set. And by giving us the knowledge that they're there, it becomes particularly frustrating that, for example, every on-screen puppet is white, while many of the unseen are not. Cutbirth doesn't believe that you can tell a story about the unseen by showing them, because showing them cheapens it. You can't make an unseen person seen until the world is ready to treat them the way it treats an actually seen person. And that's kind of fascinating, right? It's sort of like the immersive theater of Synecdoche, New York turned up to 11. The lives that everyone is living are at first visible to someone walking the streets, but the artifice of that eventually requires walls of the buildings go up. And suddenly, no one can see anything more than they could on an actual street. The fanatical artist becomes so obsessed with depicting the realism of an experience that he recreates the smallest details and hides them away where no one will ever see them but him. And perhaps it's a little Kaufman too. Everything he makes is ultimately about him, sometimes more literally than others. And though he's not concerned with depicting reality exactly as it exists, of course, far from it, there is a meticulousness to his stories. All of that nonsense in ANTKIND ultimately fits together. He couldn't have cut any deeper because then the links that bind it all together would have been broken. In the moment, it can feel like too much, like what you're experiencing has come out of nowhere, but it doesn't. And you realize later that it has been set up or is itself set up. By the time you reach the end, it all makes sense. I mean, kind of. 8.0 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hammer and Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlasianFMA, Magnolia Denton, Elliot Fowler, and Greg Lucina. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.